Are you going to stand?
I'm going to stand. I'm going to stand over there so that I'm on the camera. Or actually, if the camera's there, I can stand here because I don't have a problem with the technology.
You could just stay seated.
No, I won't. It's better if I stand. Believe me.
Może. Crystal.
Yeah.
Shall we switch?
Okay. Good. We're switching.
Good evening to all. Welcome to the Institute for Human Sciences. My name is Ivan Vejvoda. I'm a permanent fellow here, and I will host this evening with our. So welcome to our political salon, the first one in this 2019. Christian, as you know, is the foreign editor of the Presse and has been a pillar of the salons as we have had them. And we are here this evening, and I guess that's why we have a great turnout, to welcome Misha Glenny, who will talk on the topic of McMafia and the geopolitics of crime. But let me introduce, before Misha takes the floor, very briefly, for those of you who are unacquainted with his prior work. Misha is a journalist and writer. He worked for The Guardian and the BBC. He actually lived in Vienna for several years in the late 80s, from 1986. So this is, in a sense, his own town. It was a time when he covered the end of communism in Central and Eastern Europe and the breakdown of Yugoslavia, and his first two books were in fact devoted to that. And very appropriately, his first book, after Fukuyama had written his book, The End of History, the title of his first book was The Rebirth of History, as those of us who come from the former Yugoslavia, myself included, went through that very difficult period. He then wrote The Fall of Yugoslavia in '92, and then sort of went back to a deeper insight into the history and wrote a big book called The Balkans, Nationalism, War, and Great Powers. And if I may add as a footnote, those of us who wrote or lived it thought that this was a total exception to the rule, that there would be populism, nationalism. In fact, it turns out that this was a sort of harbinger, an announcement of what we are unfortunately living today in many countries where far right and far left populism has reared its ugly head. The theme of tonight was the theme of his book published 10 years ago, McMafia, in 2008. And he subsequently wrote two books, one on the dark market, which is basically an extension of the theme through cybercrime, and then finally a book on Brazil called Nemesis. For full disclosure, Misha and I have been friends for, I dare not say how long, and so it's wonderful to have him here with us today, and as a visiting fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences. Misha.
Thank you, Ivan. I'm going to, oh, please. I always get worried when people clap before I've actually said anything, because it might be absolute nonsense. So I'm going to stand up. Unfortunately, I was going to have a presentation with me, but largely due to problems with my equipment, I won't be able to show it, unfortunately. So you'll just have to put up with me talking. So I'll try and talk through what I was going to say with the presentation. So as Ivan pointed out, I came here in 1986, and I was working for The Guardian and New Scientist, writing about Eastern Europe. My relationship with New Scientist was perfect because I knew nothing about science and they knew nothing about Eastern Europe, and so we got along very, very well indeed. But before I came here to Vienna as a correspondent, I was actually part of an organized criminal syndicate. And I used to smuggle books and dismembered Xerox machines across the Iron Curtain into Eastern Europe to groups like Charter 77 and Solidarity and the Hungarian opposition. So So I know what I'm talking about when it comes to organized crime. I used to stuff the material. Well, the best thing to do if you want to smuggle stuff across Eastern Europe, always choose the Romanian railway carriages, because they're the ones that are always falling down. So I was able to put the material behind the toilets and the paneling of the train, because they were very easy to take apart, stuff them there, do it up, and then when I got over onto the other side, take them out again. It was great fun. So when it came to 1989, although by this time I was the BBC's Central Europe correspondent, and so all my political affiliations had fallen away because I was now an objective journalist and nothing else. But I was secretly very, very pleased about 1989, and we were all, let's face it, we were all feeling a sense of euphoria in 1989, that at last those things we'd been hoping for, the coming together of Europe, was actually going to be realized. But sadly, it was not just the ideology of communism which collapsed in 1989. For a significant number of years, the state also suffered a heart attack in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And while it was on life support, of course, another big change was taking place. And that was the very dramatic shift from the planned economy of the communist era into to the new free market economy of the victorious, the victorious West. So capitalism was introduced in a very short space of time. The problem is that people in Eastern Europe, they didn't have the regulatory structures required to effect a smooth transition. So, for example, you would have two businessmen from Russia, say at the dawn of capitalism, and one of them would say to the other, look, I want to sell you these widgets for 3 rubles apiece. And the other businessman would say, well, I'd like to buy your widgets, but I'm only going to pay you 2 rubles 50 kopecks for them. And the other one would say, well, let's go to a commercial court in that case, and we can resolve this dispute through those mechanisms. And then the other one would say, unfortunately, there is no commercial court system here in Russia because the state, as I said, has had a heart attack. But then he would say, but don't worry about it because I've got a solution, because I have friends who belong to a so-called privatized law enforcement agency. And I'm sure that they will be able to persuade you to accept a reasonable price for the widgets. And then the other businessman said, oh, that's fantastic, because I've got a privatized law enforcement agency too, and I'm sure they can make you accept an even more reasonable price. Now, the privatized law enforcement agency is known more colloquially by us as the mob or the mafia. And this is exactly what happened in Sicily in the 1850s and 1860s, when you had a rapid transformation from a sort of late feudal system to an emerging capitalist economy in Sicily, which is why the mafia emerged then in that part of the world. And the same thing was happening, but on a huge scale, in the former Soviet Union after 1989 and 1990. And this is extremely important, because what it means is that in Russia and elsewhere, capitalism and organized criminal structures were integrated right at the very beginning. You can't separate them. So what would happen, of course, is that you got a few very smart people who were ahead of the game in terms of entrepreneurial spirit in these countries, and they would make a lot of money very quickly, basically by seizing state assets and privatizing them. It was done in different ways in different East European countries, but this is what happened. And this was the oligarchic class. So, for example, if you take people like Berezovsky or Abramovich, Deripaska, well, if we take Berezovsky and Abramovich, one of the things that they were doing is they were buying oil for $1 a barrel in Siberia, and they were selling it in Latvia onto international markets for $30 a barrel. So this was absolutely enormous markups. But if you were going to prosper when you were playing this game, you had to have your own private protection agency to make sure that other people didn't move into that market. And we saw this being replicated all over Eastern Europe. I don't know if you know, but between 1989 and 1991, the Bulgarian government was so broke, it was so penniless, that it was compelled to fire 14,000 police officers and intelligence agents in Bulgaria, 14,000 people. Now, at a time when your state is collapsing and your economy is going south at a rate of knots, probably the last cohort of people you want coming onto the labor market are 14,000 people whose primary skills are surveillance, smuggling, sabotage, and murder. But that's what happened in Bulgaria, and that's what happened everywhere else. And very soon, I don't know if you remember in Bulgaria, do you remember before the Cold War was over during the Olympics, the Bulgarians, small country, 9 million people or whatever, they would always win medals at the Olympics in things like wrestling and weightlifting. And these guys in Bulgaria were basically communist superstars. And they had a tremendous status, and that status, of course, was underwritten by the state. But when the state collapsed, they could no longer finance the wrestlers and the weightlifters. And so you had this unholy coming together of former police officers and former soldiers and weightlifters and wrestlers, and they all joined in the game of becoming privatized law enforcement agents. So you had this criminalized class, a large criminalized class, and remember, the state is still having a heart attack. It's still lying flat on the table, and so the people involved in privatized law enforcement agencies who are facilitating the market activity of people like Berezovsky and Abramovich, in a very short space of time, they say, wait a minute, we can involve ourselves in this game as well. Why don't we join in the market? So instead of just regulating the markets, they became involved in the markets as well. And because the state is not capable at this time of defining what is legal and what is illegal, because it can barely get out of bed in the morning, that means that along with selling food and furniture and whatever it is, aluminium or oil or whatever, they found that they could sell heroin. They could take heroin from Tajikistan using military transporters out of Afghanistan into Tajikistan, then to Moscow. They could take illegally farmed caviar out of the Caspian Sea, take that to Moscow, then on to the restaurants of France and London. And they could start trafficking women for sexual purposes from all over the former Soviet Union. And fairly soon after that, so this was in Russia itself, this was gangster capitalism. It's a very, very important concept, and it was a very dramatic system. There was a lot of violence involved in it. And also, it led to extreme rates of inequality in a very short space of time in Russia. So that in 1998, when you had the financial crash in Russia, the collapse of the ruble, 40% of the Russian population was living under the poverty line. The life expectancy of males in Russia over the first 10 years after 1989 collapsed from the age of 69 to the age of 58. So when it comes a little later on to Putin assuming power and replacing the oligarchs with a network of KGB officers, he was able to build on the fact that gangster capitalism for the bulk of the Russian population was not only frightening because of the levels of violence, but it was frightening because of the degree of insecurity that it created in that society. Anyway, with these goods and services, you had this huge swathe of territory from the Slovene, Austrian, and Italian border in the west to the Chinese-Russian border in the east. You had this huge lawless zone, and in this sort of reverse Silk Road, you were getting all sorts of illicit goods and services being transported. And around this time, another major trauma happens in Eastern Europe, and that is the wars in Yugoslavia. So what happens during the wars in Yugoslavia is that underneath that fog of war, remember that most of the paramilitary organizations like Arkan's people in Serbia, they were made up of people who had been working in organized criminal syndicates during the 70s and 80s because Yugoslav peoples had access to Western Europe, they could travel and so on. And so you had the return of criminal networks back into Yugoslavia, and they worked as paramilitary people. But I realized that there was something much, much bigger and much more organized than this going on in 2003 when Ivan's old boss and our good friend Zoran Djindjic was murdered in March 2003 because he was murdered on the order of a man who was nicknamed Legia. And Legia was a former member of the special forces working for Milosevic. He was also a very close associate with Belgrade's largest organized crime group, the Zemun clan. Anyway, on the day of Djindjic's murder, Legia disappeared, and he disappeared for 2 years. Later on, he returned to Belgrade and gave himself in, and he was eventually convicted of Djindjic's murder. But the interesting thing is where was he for those 2 years when he went missing? And it turned out subsequently that he was under the protection of a man called Hrvoje Petrac in Croatia, who was the boss of Croatia's largest organized crime group. So this was obviously counterintuitive. What is a Serbian nationalist like Legia doing being protected by Petrac in Croatia? And the answer to that lies in Legia's nickname, which means legionnaire in Serbian and Croatian. And that's because Petrac and Legia were serving together in the 1980s in the French Foreign Legion. And they became very good friends. And what happened when they went back to Yugoslavia and the fog of war came down over that territory is they cooperated. And not only did Croat and Serb organized crime gangs cooperate, but so did Albanians, so did Bosniaks, so did Macedonians, so did Bulgarians, so did Hungarians, so did Greeks. And what they were doing was facilitating the transit of illicit goods and services coming from all over the world, which were straining to get into their largest market. And their largest market, of course, was the European Union, fast on its way to becoming the most powerful and lucrative consumer market in history. And a significant amount of European citizens like to spend some of their leisure, some of their spare cash, sticking 50 euro notes up their nose, or sleeping with trafficked women, or smoking untaxed cigarettes. So all of a sudden, you started to get this globalization of organized crime. And there was one thing that those people involved, whether they were from Russia or whether they were from Serbia or their new business partners in Colombia or in Afghanistan, there's one thing that they noticed, that there was something else going on in the world at that time. And that was the rise of financial capitalism, which had begun with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan's decision to supercharge financial capitalism by lifting foreign exchange controls and by introducing various financial mechanisms with the Big Bang. And all of a sudden, you were able to shift money around the world in amounts and at speeds that no one had ever been able to do before. And this led to an extraordinary economic boom, which turned out later on to be a speculative boom. But nonetheless, these mechanisms were extremely convenient if you wanted to shift money, invest money, without people really being able to monitor it. And London and New York entered into a race to become the financial capital of the world. And both of them started lowering their regulatory standards as a consequence. And so people involved in organized crime realized that there were these fantastic new easy ways of laundering their money. And London, my city, became the primary focus of money laundering in the Western world. The government security minister, Ben Wallace, agreed for the first time this year that something in the region of £90 billion are laundered through the United Kingdom by criminal syndicates every single year. And we know how it's done. It's done through a system primarily called anonymous companies. So you have anonymous companies in places like the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. And you can set up this company and you can use that company to invest money in London property. And you don't have to tell the British government who the beneficial owner of that company is. So it's something of a little irony, I think, that when we see this government saying that they're determined to take back control all the time by wrecking our economy, by leaving the European Union, at the same time, they still have no idea who the actual owner of 10,000 residential properties, 10,000 in the borough of Westminster alone, owned by anonymous companies. They could be Chinese gambling consortia, they could be Russian mafia, they could be Mexican cartels, they could be dissolute, narcissistic American property developers, they could be arms dealers from France, they could be anyone, but we don't know. And that money goes in and out of our country the whole time, and a lot of it is criminalized money. So these two things, the collapse of the former Soviet Union and the very sort of traumatic introduction of market systems, combined with the rise of financial capitalism, of what has facilitated the globalization of organized crime. Now, before I finish, I have to just briefly add a sort of geopolitical dimension, because something else changed in 1999 and 2000, and that is we saw the rise of a different type of criminal organization. So I don't know if you remember the year 2000. The year 2000 was the first time that we saw a computer virus go around the world in less than 48 hours. And it was called the I Love You virus. And it was very, very, very successful, because there you were. It was a weekend. You'd be working away at your computer. You'd be very, very bored because it's a weekend and you're working. And then all of a sudden in your inbox, you'd see an email drop in and it says, I love you. And it would be from somebody you knew. And it may well have been from somebody who you've always harbored a little flame for. And you get very excited by that. And so as soon as you see that, you click on it, and then you're doomed and your computer is infected and you spread the virus all over the world. Now, I was very fortunate when the I Love You virus first came out, very fortunate indeed, because the first person I received it from was my ex-wife. And she harbored all sorts of emotions towards me, but I can assure you, love was not amongst them. So as soon as I saw that there, I love you from, straight into the recycle bin. Now, this was at the very beginning of a huge rise in criminal activity on the internet, and there was a wonderful website called carterplanet.com, and they came up with the revolutionary method that ensured that cybercrime was going to spread, and that spread very, very quickly. And that was, they were criminals. So Carter Planet was a sort of Facebook for criminals. You could go there, you could buy and sell things, you could download the latest viruses to use against your enemies, all sorts of things. And Carter Planet, they came up with the escrow system for criminals, because the problem for criminals is if you're doing business on the internet, you're faced with this dilemma of how can I trust the guy I'm doing business with, because I know he's a criminal, so he's axiomatically untrustworthy. So they came up with this thing called the escrow system. So if you wanted to sell the cloned data of 5,000 credit cards, you would send it to the Carter Planet escrow officer. And then if you wanted to buy those, you would send the money digitally to the escrow officer, and the escrow officer would check the data with his friends in Toronto or Wellington or Rio by sending out some of the credit card data, and they would try it on local ATMs. And then if they worked, they would keep that money as a fee for the escrow system, and then they would release the credit cards to the purchaser and the money to the vendor. And this led to an explosion of cybercrime, and it built up all sorts of networks. Now, what's happened recently is that for 10 years or so, cybercrime was also very important and interesting, because there is a fundamental difference between cybercrime and traditional organized crime, sort of mafia crime. And that is, if you want to be engaged in traditional organized crime, you have to be able to threaten or deploy violence. If you can't use violence, you're not in the game. You can't say. Cybercrime is revolutionary because you don't need to use violence. So you can be, a pimply 15-year-old in Astana in Kazakhstan, stealing money from somebody in LA and cashing it out in Dubai. So what that's done is that it has changed the criminological and sociological profile of people involved in crime if they're doing it through the internet, because you don't need to be a former Bulgarian weightlifter. You can be someone who's very smart, who's young, 12 to 15. That's when they start getting involved, and build up networks all around the world. You can bring down complex systems very easily. You can blackmail people. It's extraordinary. But what we have seen as states become involved in cybercriminal and hacking activity is you start to see, first of all, you've seen a fusion of state-sponsored hacking activity and criminal activity. But also over the past 5 years or so, what you've had is, in the traditional organized crime groups, you've had leaders growing up and taking over from their fathers. I use the gender advisedly there. And they happen to be digital natives. And so they understand much better the value of cyber when it comes to traditional organized crime. So there is now not a single area of organized criminal activity, of buying and selling stuff, which doesn't have a significant cyber component to it, whether it's the smuggling of human beings across Europe, or whether it is the very dramatic explosion in the sale of illegal narcotics over the internet. All sorts of things, even things like burglary. People are using drones and that sort of thing to scope out potential victims. So we have come to a situation now where what at first seemed like, just another thing, another sort of bit of material for Hollywood because it's about crime and everyone likes crime. We now see presidents around the world. We can take the president of Russia and we can take the president of the United States, who have numerous links to organized criminal activity, one way or the other. We know that with all of the strong men around the world. But we are also seeing a response to this. We are seeing a variety of people, a variety of organizations, whether they're NGOs like Global Witness, which is one that I'm involved in, or whether it's tenacious tax lawyers, or police officers, or politicians. When McMafia, my television series, came out at the beginning of last year in the United Kingdom, this led to a renewal of the campaign to try and get rid of the anonymous companies. Theresa May's government, although David Cameron was actually, it's the one thing that Cameron did in his prime ministership, which was of value. David Cameron worked very, very hard to try and stop these networks of corruption from penetrating the United Kingdom. Theresa May turns out, is less interested in that sort of thing. But nonetheless, we had a big campaign last year when McMafia came out, and thanks to two tenacious MPs in Parliament, we finally got legislation through which will eventually lead to the end of anonymous companies and anonymous investing in the United Kingdom, although sadly last week it looks as though Theresa May is again with all the chaos going on with Brexit, she's trying to kick this into the long grass, doubtless in anticipation of Jacob Rees-Mogg's new career after Brexit of an international hedge fund manager. But I speculate. So there are things that can happen. There are things that can change. There is a big struggle going on in the world between those people who say that political corruption, its relationship with organized crime and in some cases big corporate business is unacceptable, and we are going to do something about it. And then you have people like Trump and Putin who are obviously perfectly happy in engaging with this sort of activity. But I think that it is one of the most serious global political issues of the day, not the only one, but one very important one, and one that if we don't win it, it will be much, much harder to do something about that other big social economic issue around the world, which is the rise in wealth inequality, which I think in some respects is at the bottom of all of this. Anyway, that's quite enough from me, and so I'm going to be quiet now. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for your presentation. I hope you will not be quiet because I will ask you some questions. I hope that you can answer them. Well, you somehow explained to us the preconditions back in '89 for the rise of organized crime, especially in Russia and in Eastern Europe. And I would like that you could corroborate on one issue that you have touched, because of course there was a change when Putin entered the political stage. He tried obviously to rein in the oligarchs. In your last comments, you have hinted at some links between the political sphere and organized crime. So I would be interested to hear more about those links. What are today the political preconditions for organized crime to flourish and blossom?
So when Putin came in, bearing in mind that people in Russia were fed up with gangster capitalism and having a deeply alcoholic president who was completely controlled by Berezovsky and the other oligarchs, he essentially flipped the situation around whereby the oligarchs had subordinated KGB officers. Almost all of them had senior KGB officers in their entourage. And Putin basically said to them, right, okay, this is how it's going to happen from now on. We will be in control, and you have a choice. You can cooperate with us, which is fine, but then you do what we say, or you can compete with us. And in that case, we will bring the whole force of the state against you. Some people chose to compete with him and contest him. So Bierozovsky, Gusinski were classic examples. Some decided to cooperate, like Deripaska, Abramovich. So Abramovich, at the time when Putin came to power, was governor of Chukotka province. And when Putin came to power, Chukotka, like all provinces, elected their governors. And one of the first things that Putin did was to abolish the election of governors because it created local power centers. And he said to Abramovich, okay, this is the deal. You have to sell us half of Sibneft, half of your oil concern. You can keep the rest and you can do with it what you want. You can go and buy a Premiership football club if you like. We don't care. You can move to London. But you have to remain as my appointed governor of Chukotka province and do what I say. As it happened, Abramovich didn't want to be Chukotka province governor anymore, but he reluctantly accepted to do it, and then he was able to move to London, buy Chelsea, and so on and so forth. And so you had that flip around of the oligarchs and so on.
But is this really organized crime, or are these just wild entrepreneurs in an oligarchic system? So what is your definition of being?
Because of the fact that the oligarchs are still relying on their criminalized entourages. Now, you can legalize them and say that they are now a registered privatized law enforcement agency, and that's one of the things that you can do. But they are still engaging in a lot of criminal activity, and provided it doesn't interfere with what Putin and his immediate entourage are up to, then that activity is partially tolerated. And we know when it comes to the purchase of Trump's properties in Manhattan and Florida, then known Russian organized crime figures moving between Russia and the United States were involved in these purchases, and the FSB knows exactly what is going on. Now, what the exact link between those organized crime figures like Sater or Felix Sater or like Mogilevich in Russia itself actually is with the FSB and Putin and Trump, we're not entirely sure. We know about Sater, we're not so sure about Mogilevich, but we do know that Mogilevich is involved in this. So yes, you do see organized criminal figures engage with this, and you still see a lot of cigarettes coming through Russia, untaxed cigarettes, which then go through Poland and elsewhere and onto the European Union market. Women are still being trafficked.
If you could give us an idea of where the business lies in organized crime, it obviously has shifted, and there's some sort of a digitalization of organized crime. But if you would just give us an estimate of where the money lies in this business, is it still mostly traditional organized crime business like smuggling, or has this changed?
If you look at it globally, when you're looking at traditional organized crime, let's take the drugs market. The drugs market is the single most important for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's one of the biggest, estimated currently at about $500 billion a year worldwide. Secondly, it is an important entry point for a lot of people who become involved in organized crime. It's easy to get into the drugs market quite quickly. Thirdly, it's controlled by big players. So, the shifting of large amounts of cocaine from Colombia through Brazil over to Europe or through Mexico into the United States requires extremely sophisticated organizations which have to engage in political corruption, the undermining of institutions. In Colombia and Brazil, less so when it gets to the European Union or the United States.
Why?
Because here you're selling your product.
Okay.
Here you want to be as invisible as possible because the institutions are stronger than they are in Colombia and Brazil. And here is where you get your money. So you don't want public attention, you don't want media attention, you don't want political or
Are there main gates for those drugs in Europe, or are there gates all over the place? So that
there are main gates coming into Europe, primarily Spain and Italy and the Balkans, but also Russia. But things are changing. The illegal narcotics market is absolutely fascinating because things are changing for three reasons. They're changing very fundamentally. First of all, you have the legalization of marijuana across Canada, which is absolutely huge. It's a big, big game changer. And also, that was last October. States in the United States, one by one, New York is now considering legalizing, and with New York and California, then you've got most of the American market having legal marijuana. The second big game changer is the fact that last year 72,000 people died of overdoses in the United States, which is absolutely off the scale of the level of victimhood in 100 years on the war on drugs. But the key thing about that is that those spiraling rates of addiction are the consequences of legal pharmaceutical companies' products, OxyContin in particular, made by Purdue Pharma, who are part of the Sackler family empire. This is changing the nature of how you police drugs.
In which way is the legalization of marijuana a game changer? Is this good news or bad news?
It's very, very good news. It's very good news. The illegal marijuana trade in Canada, according to Canadian official statistics, is worth 11 billion Canadian dollars a year. That $11 billion stays outside of the state's purview. It's an unregulated trade. What Canada has done is the marijuana that is sold will now benefit the licit economy, including the state. So if you take Colorado, where it's been legal for 5 years already, last year Colorado derived $120 million in tax revenue from marijuana, twice as much from what they derived from alcohol. And those tax dollars are hypothecated. They go straight into the public health and the public education system. And the point is, and this is where Canada is really important, is now you can research into marijuana, its benefits and its drawbacks. As a medicine, it's an extraordinary medicine anyhow. And up until now, because of the war on drugs, we haven't been able to research it scientifically properly. But also you can regulate its strength, just as we did with alcohol. You can ensure that you don't get large amounts of the psychotic varieties spreading around the place, and so on and so forth. But then, there's a third thing which I haven't mentioned, and that is when you look at the internet, what's been happening with the internet. About 25% of narcotics, illegal narcotics consumed in the United Kingdom now, are sold via the internet. They are not sold on streets. Buying drugs on the internet is safer if you're a consumer. The quality is higher, but the problem for law enforcement, and if you persist with some of these policies, is that up until now, our drugs have been produced in Colombia and in Afghanistan, and the people who have suffered are the South Americans or the Central Asians. So, for example, in Brazil, last year, 60,000 people were murdered in Brazil. Over half of that was a consequence of the war on drugs. The death rate in Brazil between 2012 and 2016 was identical to the death rate in Syria. But it's not considered a civil war because it's just people arguing about drugs. But it's actually to do with American demand on drugs, and this is sort of unacceptable morally. But what's happened now is that those drugs that we buy on the internet, on the whole, tend to be produced in Europe. So MDMA, which is ecstasy, which is the widest sold drug on the internet in Europe, that is all produced in southern Holland, in North Brabant, around the Limburg area. These are vast profits, and law enforcement, which until now has only had to police distribution and consumption, now has to manage production as well. And this is after 10 years of austerity policies because of 2008. And the shift of distribution onto the internet means that police forces have to start employing people who understand the internet and who understand computer technology. And they don't have the resources to do that. So what you're seeing is an extraordinary increase in the ease with which drugs are circulating around Europe, and something has to be done on a policy level to deal with this.
At the end of your presentation, you said that it's essential to win this war. Now you've talked about not enough means for police enforcement, about a situation where obviously it's very hard to get an overview of what is happening in cyberspace and in internet. So this makes this job of winning this war very difficult.
It does, but there are certain policies that you can introduce, like, for example, making transparent the money that flows through your capital and flows through your property. There are certain things that you can introduce which will make it much more difficult for people to launder their money. If you have a rational policy on drugs, there's a lot you can do. We have seen in 2015 the difficulty that Europe faces when it's confronted with a large migration of people. Now, the director of Europol at the time, Rob Wainwright, told me that his officers were investigating 29,000 individuals suspected of being involved in that operation of moving 1 million people from the Maghreb and from Turkey, coming from Central Asia and Syria, into Europe. These are very, very well-oiled machines. Now, you can't deal with that unless you deal with the migration problem. So there are certain aspects of the organized crime culture which are the consequence of policies that aren't working. There are certain aspects of organized crime culture that are to do with policing and how you do the policing. The problem is these are very, very big issues, and they require cooperation on an international level. Now, if you take Brexit, for example, and this is something that I've been saying in the UK, but not many people listen, one of the things we haven't discussed in the UK about Brexit is security policy, and I include policing in that. So, first of all, for the Russians, Brexit is such an easy win, because if Britain leaves the EU, you cut the link between the Five Eyes intelligence services and the intelligence services of the European Union. Not only that, we have to leave Europol on the 30th of March this year.
Well, I thought there would be cooperation and security issues would still go on.
Not there. We have to agree it. You know, the European Union is, as we know, a bureaucratic organization. At the moment, as of the 30th of March, British officers leave Europol, they walk out of the desk, and they're locked out of the building. That's the situation. I know. I was in Europol in December, and they made it very clear to me what the situation is. Data transfer. The data transfer is going to be a regulatory nightmare with the United Kingdom when we leave. There are all sorts of areas where we are very, very closely involved, and a lot of them is to do with security. The European arrest warrant, that has to be renegotiated. When we leave the European arrest warrant as well. And I try and remind people in the United Kingdom that several of the people involved in terrorist attacks in the UK would still be in the black hole that is the criminal justice system of Italy, were it not for the European arrest warrant. You know, for the Brits, the European arrest warrant is only a sovereignty issue and nothing else. It has nothing to do with law enforcement. So there are countless areas where people haven't realized how it's going to impact on us. And if you're going to deal with organized crime, you need smarter policies when it comes to money laundering. You need smarter policies when it comes to drugs and the regulation of some services and goods which are now illicit but maybe need not be illicit. And you need coordination on big policies like immigration and so on. But you know, this is like everything we face in the world, from the environment through artificial intelligence through to the internet and so on.
Okay, well, let's open it up to the audience here, and I'll take 3 questions at a time, and do raise your hands, and we'll start right here.
Thank you very much, first of all, for your enlightening information you gave to us. Actually, I read your book in 2008 when I was living in Bulgaria, and I'm actually quite deep into the situation in that country, therefore you cannot separate in all the Balkan countries. I also spent many years in other countries. Nowadays, the political structure, organized crime, and business. This is interlinked in a way where it is very, very difficult to change it. And intelligence is always in the background. I identified once the 40 richest, it's more than 10 years ago, so the situation certainly changed, 40 richest Bulgarians, and the majority of them had secret service background. You know, of course, the situation in Varna, where 3 men took over the Tim group, so-called, and they are still in power as far as I know. So I would like to get from you some more information on this role of intelligence, former intelligence, present intelligence, particularly in Southeastern Europe, for the organized crime situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this entertaining but not always funny presentation. And well, my question is about the following. First of all, you didn't define what is mafia. You explain it on some examples. Would you large-scale corruption and breakdown of institutional power also considered to be mafia? And if so, then you would have to, under the title Geopolitics, look also into the, let's say, mafia in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and so on. And then you immediately come to a question, why speak only about post-communist situation? Why not about post-colonial situation? Thank you.
And then finally, the third question there in the first round, right behind you.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. My name is Yulia Zabolina. I originally come from Ukraine, but currently I work in the US for Georgia College of Criminal Justice, and we use your book, McMafia book, for teaching purposes from time to time, especially with undergraduate students. They love the style, that it's easy to follow, and it always is very nice examples. So we are very grateful to you for this book. Now, the reason why I came to Vienna is that because I'm running a winter school together with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. So we have a couple of winter school participants with me. Raise your hands, those who are from the winter school. Okay. Those who survived. We have 40 participants, but they probably got tired of already 2 days of organized crime discussions. So because we have this partnership with the UNODC, my question has something to do with the UN. In the United States, especially with the Trump administration, there has been a lot of criticism of the United Nations, that it's dysfunctional institutions, that it's an expensive institution. and very similar remarks. So, in your opinion, how would you evaluate the contribution of the UNODC, which was created slightly before your book was out? And what would you recommend, hypothetically speaking, in a perfect world, international organizations, UN and others, could do to help counter the problem of organized crime? Thank you.
Okay, back to you, Misha. Could I just footnote
Yes.
that last one was the name of Firtash?
Yes.
Okay,
Firtash.
go ahead.
Okay.
Bulgaria.
Intelligence agents are very important in all of this, and always have been. I mean, when I was talking about those people who were sacked in Bulgaria, some of them were intelligence agents, but not only that. If you look in Bulgaria in 1986, under pressure from Gorbachev, Zhivkov introduced joint stock companies. Where you could, foreigners could come in and invest 49% and 51% it would be Bulgarian state money. Actually, if you look at those joint stock companies, all of them were nominally owned by members of the DS, of the secret police. And what was happening, and you saw this in Poland, you saw this in Czechoslovakia as well, is that those people who were in intelligence agencies, they knew that communism was coming to an end, and so they were preparing themselves for a bright new future of capitalism and personal enrichment. And of course, they had the networks. So someone like Lukhanov in Bulgaria, who was prime minister, who was a liberal communist party member and a very entertaining character. He was steeped, however, in networks in Moscow. And he was very important for the linking up, particularly of the finance system between Moscow and Bulgaria. Poor old Andrei got it wrong somewhere along the line because he was assassinated in 1991, I believe, or 92, I can't remember. Yeah, it's very early on. So, but obviously, the point about intelligence agencies is that you have network. Not all intelligence officers were involved in this. By any stretch of the imagination. But of course, the nature of intelligence is you have to deal with people who are involved in criminal activity. I have observed this most obviously on the internet, where my book on cybercrime was called Dark Market. Dark Market was a successor to Carter Planet. It was a forum for internet criminals, and there were undercover agents from virtually every European and American intelligence agency on Dark Market, pretending to be cyber criminals, but actually trying to gather information. What is happening in cyber is, I mean, people do not fully yet grasp the extent of how dangerous the dark net is, and what is going on with that, particularly with the most recent technological developments. So, for example, the Internet of Things, which is talked about a great deal, the Internet of Things has magnified the ability of people engaged in cyber malfeasance, not necessarily cybercrime, because there are all sorts of people who get up to no good. And 2 years ago, we had the first major Internet of Things cyber attack with something called the Mirai bot, which was 40 times more powerful than any botnet that people had identified before. And the problem with the Internet of Things is that we are outsourcing computer security to machines. And the issue of machine-to-machine learning and artificial intelligence within the Internet of Things is something which is now really frightening lots of people, whether they're in private security companies or whether they're police or whether they're ordinary users or corporations or whatever. So things are magnifying very, very rapidly. And intelligence agents are deeply involved with all of this, including some of them engaged in criminal activity themselves. The problem about places like Bulgaria is that when corrupt criminal networks put down their roots, they put them down very deeply, and it's extremely difficult to pull them up. The European Union has made more progress than people imagine in mitigating this when it comes to the insistence on the creation of independent criminal justice systems. I know that there are big holes in it. We know what's going on in Romania at the moment, Bulgaria, and so on. But progress has been made. But what people have to understand with anti-corruption programs is this is a matter of decades, not a matter of years. Now, when it comes to the developing world and other parts of the world, in McMafia, I deal with all those places, but I deal with it within the same. What was happening is that there were many markets in the developing world which were closed markets for different reasons, whether it was South Africa, whether it was Brazil, whether it was India, whether it was China. And the phenomenon that you saw in the former Soviet Union was to a degree replicated in those other territories, and they started cooperating. If you look at somewhere like South Africa, for example, after 1994, the sort of generally accepted big media story about South Africa and crime was that it became an incredibly dangerous place, and people were being shot and raped and so on and so forth. In fact, more interesting than that was the fact that up until 1994, the police, the policing of South Africa was focused on 15% of the population. So under apartheid, 15% of the population had proper police services. Once you change in 1994, the state has to offer police services to 100% of the population, which it wasn't capable of doing. And it did one or two things. It allowed the emergence of privatized law enforcement agencies like Chubb, like ADT and things like that. And it got the white community to pay for its own policing. So when you go to South Africa, the white areas, they are all policed by private companies and not by the South African Police Service. But the other thing that happened was that they had to withdraw police services from all sorts of areas. Most importantly, the border areas. South Africa has 700 airports, most of them just landing strips. And they ceased to be policed because the resources had to go in policing the cities and the urban areas. And what that meant was that South Africa became the hub for organized crime syndicates from all over the world, whether they were Russian, whether they were Chinese, whether they were French, whether they were Italian, whether they were Colombian or Brazilian, whether they were American. They all went to South Africa because South Africa had a first world infrastructure and a third world, developing world policing capacity. And so actually the real crime story in South Africa was that this was where all the criminals came and started globalizing and started doing businesses across continents. But underdevelopment and lack of state resources, weak states are often at the heart of where organized crime is able to emerge in terms of production and distribution. But organized crime is also about the developed world because we are the zone of consumption. If it wasn't for us, there wouldn't be any point in growing cocaine because it's we who take the cocaine and we who are prepared to pay huge amounts of money for it. So one has to look at it as a kind of international business chain and as a rational business where you have a lot of rational actors who have different functions depending on where they are along the chain. And then finally, in terms of the UNODC, I don't know whether it's the same under Trump, but until Trump, the UNODC was the only agency that the United States paid its full whack on time every year on the date that it was required. And that's because there was huge pressure from Congress and from successive presidents to prosecute the war on drugs. And for a long time, the UNODC, in my opinion, was a pretty reactionary organization, which basically did the bidding of the Americans and the Europeans in terms of the war on drugs. But I noticed at the time of when I was researching McMafia that certain departments in the UNODC were bringing in researchers who had a much more detailed and nuanced understanding of organized crime and how it worked. And I detected a change in the culture of the UNODC, which really started to look at organized crime in its totality, as opposed to something that one is just prosecuting in order to gain brownie points politically at home. And so I now see it as being moving towards being part of the solution as opposed to being part of the problem. And there are certain other initiatives which the UNODC cooperates with as well. It's now a quite interesting organization. It wasn't always.
Okay, let's do a second round.
May I insert
Sure.
a short question? Because I wondered, sifting through your book and knowing that two journalists have been murdered recently for their work, one in Malta, the other one in Slovakia. Have you ever, if I may ask this personal question, have you ever been threatened?
I've certainly been threatened. I've been in dangerous situations because one of the points about McMafia and indeed dark market as well is that I insist on talking to people who are engaged in organized crime because otherwise I can't really understand what's going on. But I am quite careful about how I approach those people. And
You stay polite.
I'm very polite, very respectful, and I don't accuse them of being murderers to their face. I use the example of Roberto Saviano, who's a friend of mine who wrote Gomorrah. And Roberto is an incredibly courageous man who stood up and pointed the finger at individuals who have, through their work as part of the Camorra, have wrecked the lives of countless Neapolitans and countless Italians. And he has become a very, very important symbol of hope for millions of Italians. And I admire his courage endlessly, and he's had to pay a huge price in his personal life for standing up in this way. So that is what Roberto does. What I do is something slightly different. What I like to do is to try and explain how the world works and why it is working like that. And so I'm slightly less emotional than Roberto in the way that I write. But I also want the reader to be able to look at what I say and decide for themselves who is being immoral and who's not being immoral. But essentially, Roberto and I have the same goal. We just go about it. We go about it in different ways. But I have been threatened in Bulgaria, in Montenegro, and elsewhere. But I'm not as seen as much of a threat as somebody like Roberto is, who's very sort of energetically political as well.
So there's a question in the back there.
I have a question about Jacob Rees-Mogg and his crooked mates and their relationship to private law enforcement. So since 2008, certain virulent strains of extreme free market libertarian thought have become increasingly popular. Anarcho-capitalism, this kind of thing. Even if this presents an exaggerated picture of the views of Jacob Rees-Mogg, Dominic Raab, and their like, can these ideals lead to a situation anything other than the one you described in Russia in the early 1990s?
Okay. Is there another question in the back? Okay, Milan.
Yeah, thank you for the nice talk. I'm Milan here, junior visiting fellow.
Can you stand up, please?
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to, I have only a brief question, and I wanted to know how virtual currencies and technology of blockchain,
Sorry, can you say that again? I didn't hear that.
Blockchain and virtual currencies like Bitcoin and others change the organized crime, whether it changes.
Got it.
And final question over there, and then
I just want to ask, what kind of dimensions do you give to arms and child trafficking? What kind of scale are we dealing with, in your opinion?
Okay. Right, Jacob Rees-Mogg, my suspicion is that those people are on that side of the Brexit debate, the European Research Group. My real bugbear is less with Jacob Rees-Mogg, although, you know, I think he's absolutely vile. But Liam Fox is the one who really worries me. So I think their aim is to turn Britain into a sort of, you know, a free-for-all for financial capitalism. That's what they'd like to see with a no Brexit. They want to turn it into an unregulated financial area. And I think, I mean, even leaving aside the moral aspects of it, you can't do that with a country like the United Kingdom because it's a very, very diverse economy, and you can't get everyone speculating on global financial markets in a country with 65 million people or whatever it is. But I think that's what that part of the Brexit supporters want, and I think it's no coincidence that he co-founded a hedge fund which he has, of course, partially moved to Dublin and advertises to the rest of the world: protect yourself against the financial impact of Brexit by investing in my Dublin outlet. That's what he actually advertises, Rees-Mogg. I mean, the man, you know, he's sick. But anyway, that's a minor issue. In terms of cryptocurrencies, so cryptocurrencies are not used by criminals as much as people think. Bitcoin is used by criminals, Monero is used by criminals, but the reason why Bitcoin went wild and hit the 20,000 mark per Bitcoin last year was because it was a speculative bubble, and that speculative bubble has since collapsed. In short, I mean, criminals do still use Bitcoin, and although the police have become much better at tracing Bitcoin and who is using it, they haven't entirely solved the issue of attributing who the Bitcoin belongs to, but they're doing quite well on that front. The real interesting thing is not so much the cryptocurrencies, which I don't think are going to challenge fiat currencies myself. Blockchain technology is the really interesting thing, but that has nothing to do with criminality. That has to do with accountability of transactions on the net in general. And what is really, really hopeful about blockchain technology is that until now, we have to give our data to Google or to Amazon or to whoever, and they then use that to make huge sums of money by advertising to us and selling it to advertisers, and they own our data. If you belong to Instagram, for example, you don't hold copyright on any of your photograms. Instagram holds that copyright, and they can sell it to whoever they want to for whatever they want, and you have signed away that the rights to those photographs. So, but what blockchain technology does is it flips that over, and so, for example, instead of your data being stored by Dropbox, blockchain technology enables you to put your data to all sorts of computers all over the world, which are voluntarily involved in a network, And if Dropbox or Amazon or Google want to use it, they have to pay you. So you will start to own your data. And there is, going on at the moment, there is a lot of people at MIT, in Silicon Valley, around Europe, in Asia, who are working on blockchain and so-called Web 3.0, which is, with luck, is going to threaten these huge monopolistic companies who are, I think, potentially very, very damaging to our social and economic well-being. So that's what I'd say about that one. And then in terms of things like arms, and so on the child protection, I've done some work on children, and most of where that happens is not so much the trafficking of children, although trafficking of children does go on, but far worse than that is the explosion of child pornography on the internet. And the problem for law enforcement agencies with that is that this tends to be, child pornography tends to be distributed amongst interest groups who very frequently do not charge for it. So you're able to look at child pornography if you can provide child pornography of your own. And for law enforcement, this is an extraordinarily difficult area. There is a training ground for law enforcement officers here in Europe, in Germany, near Hoffenheim, where they go through specialist training, both on the use of computers, but also psychological training, because no police officer is allowed to work for longer than 3 years on child online protection issues, because it is too damaging psychologically to the individual officers involved. But of course that means that it's quite difficult building up, accumulating law enforcement capacity. So that is it's a very big problem, and it's quite a widespread problem. In terms of arms, you can buy arms over the internet. I don't know whether you're talking about large-scale arms dealing or whether you're talking about small arms. The small arms you can buy over the internet, but most European police forces work closely with intelligence agencies to try and restrict the amount of weapons that are out there and that are accessible. I don't see it as a huge problem in Europe because we put a lot of energy into it, but I do see it as a huge problem in other parts of the world, including the United States.
Okay, final very quick round, and we'll start with Luke here. And,
So my question was about the beginning of your talk, actually, in the 1990s and the transition. I was wondering if you thought it was inevitable in a way that oligarchs would, or parts of the state would respond to the introduction of market forces in this way, because you described the state as having a heart attack, and in some ways you could look at it from a different way and say, well, look, there wasn't a state that was capable of controlling and introducing effective markets. And if you look at it like that, does that mean that when the West came in and said, look, markets are wonderful and states are terrible and you just need free markets, they just sort of aggravated a problem that was already going to be there? I was just curious to see what you think.
Okay. Right there behind. Final question.
Yeah, as I understand it, the title from McMafia came because organised crime is essentially mimicking legitimate structures. So I'm wondering if you could sort of expand on the depth of that sort of the mirroring of between legitimate and illegitimate, and whether you think we can use some techniques in legitimate enterprises and actually apply them to illegitimate enterprises as well.
Okay, and final question here for the ambassador.
Thanks very much. Sean McLeod, UK Ambassador to the OSCE. It's not a question, but I'm of course paid to explain and defend the policies of the British government. with half an hour to go to the Brexit vote, I'm not going to engage on substance or talk about the challenges, undoubted challenges related to Brexit. I just one very small point just to answer what Misha said. Whatever the challenges of Brexit, the importance of continuing security cooperation is certainly very well recognised.
Thank you very much. That was an important point. Misha, final thoughts.
Yes. So Luke's question, that's very interesting. Capitalism, if it is to be effective and if it is to be sustainable, needs regulation. We need regulation urgently. We need institutions which are democratic and which hold people accountable for their decisions and their implementation. This is, for me, a sort of sine qua non. There are two things. So after the Second World War, you had the Marshall Plan. Now, the aim of the Marshall Plan was clear. It wanted to rebuild Western Europe, primarily West Germany, because it wanted stability, and it wanted stability because America had a huge industrial capacity, and it wanted to sell its goods to places, and so this was mutually beneficial. Essentially, that same relationship existed between the West and Eastern Europe in 1989, but it wasn't, in my mind, to my mind, recognized as such, except, of course, there's one case where it was recognized, which was East Germany. And East Germany, a lot of money from West Germany and from the European Union. That's one thing that the Germans occasionally forget, is how important the European Union was in stabilizing the one-to-one mark exchange. And that includes all members of the European Union at the time, including countries like Greece. And you don't have you have serious social problems in the GDR, which I don't want to underplay at all, but you don't have the type of organized crime that you see in other East European countries. So there are examples there of how you do it. There was, in my opinion, there was a venality about the West after 1989, particularly when it came to things like the paying back of debts. And I'd like to take the example of Bulgaria here. Bulgaria owed $10 billion, both as a private and debt to governments in 1989. There were discussions about trying to lower this debt repayment, and the West refused. They said, no, we want the money back. And then sanctions were imposed first on the former Yugoslavia, and there were efforts made by sensible people in the UN and elsewhere to allow Bulgaria to transport its perishable goods through its main transit route, which was Serbia, in order to get to the West European markets. And the Americans said no, and so Bulgaria had huge disruption to its exports. But not only that, it was owed $4 billion by Iraq, and then Iraq had sanctions put on it, and Bulgaria couldn't get its money back from Iraq, so it was doubly penalized. And for the West, essentially, those debts in Eastern Europe would have been peanuts. But I think that there was a sort of insistence that, you're now free market, you have to learn how to sink or swim, which certainly didn't discourage the criminalization of parts of the economies in Eastern Europe. And in terms of sorry, I've forgotten what the last question was. I do apologize. Yeah, I mean, I think that organized crime just sees what works and what doesn't work. There's a couple of fundamental differences between this. So we have a regulated market and there was actually going back to an earlier question. I forgot to say what the mafia is. We have defined the mafia. If you want to know the best way to learn about the definition of mafia is read the work of Diego Gambetta, the Sicilian mafia, and Federico Varese, the Russian mafia, and they explain what a mafia is. A mafia, when the state is absent, regulates markets and is an arbiter of disputes in a market. And as I say, what tends to happen, it's both legal markets and illegal markets. It tends to then get involved in the market itself and crosses over into that business world. But they have, if you're in a legitimate business, you have all sorts of things that you have to deal with in terms of regulations, bureaucracy, and so on and so forth. It's much simpler in organized crime because basically you have to ensure that you've got a market and that you can get your product to market, and your business risks tend to be law enforcement and your competitors. And that's really all you need to deal with. So actually working in organized crime is simpler, except when it comes to the money laundering. And that's why the rise of financial capitalism proved such a boon to organized crime, because they had relatively simple ways that they found they were able to launder that money and use it for their own purposes.
Thank you, Misha. Thank you all for coming this evening. Thank you to those of us who are virtually here with us through the live stream. Thanks to Christian and Professor for the political salon, but above all, thank you, Misha.
Thank you.